Thank you, David. I'm pleased to be in Brussels today to share my thoughts, together with the other panelists, on how we as regulators can reduce legal risk, compliance complexity, and regulatory uncertainty due to differences in the EU and US regimes. This panel's timing is fortuitous. Less than 2 weeks ago, the SEC released a rule proposal on the cross-border regulation of over-the-counter derivatives. This rule proposal is unprecedented in that for the first time, the SEC has isolated and highlighted in a targeted rule proposal how it may address cross-border activities in a pre-existing and highly globalized market, a daunting challenge to be sure. This Commission action speaks volumes to the interconnected world we regulators are charged to oversee. Before I speak further as a matter of policy, I must note that the SEC disclaims responsibility for the private statements of the SEC employees. I'm sure you've heard this before. The views I express today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the SEC, the commissioners, or colleagues on the staff. A regulator cannot escape the fact that regulatory differences exist. There always have and will due to different legal regimes, regulatory philosophies, or other unique circumstances. But not all regulatory differences matter. And due to the practical realities of the world's political and sovereign landscape, we should never expect that all differences will be resolved. To expect that to happen would be naive. Indeed, as policymakers, we have to think practically about which differences matter, which are important enough so that we diligently should strive to minimize conflicts and duplicative regulatory requirements, and which approaches we should adopt in an effort to prevent regulatory arbitrage and a race to the bottom. While often our practical thinking will compel us to seek converged regulatory approaches, we should be willing to inquire as to whether some jurisdictional differences can, in some contexts, actually be a good thing. Jurisdictions, of course, can be, and typically are, very different in many ways, each with its own culture, its own legal system, its peculiar strengths and weaknesses, and its own set of challenges. The ideal regulatory framework for any one jurisdiction is not apt to be precisely the same as for any other. Moreover, regulatory competition among jurisdictions is not all bad. Suppose one innovative jurisdiction arrives at a set of regulations, an inspection and enforcement regime, and a regulatory tool set that is the more cost-effective at protecting investors than other jurisdictions. That is, it combines lower compliance cost with better protection. Economic theory tells us that such a jurisdiction is apt to be rewarded with a lower cost of capital and may well expect some increase in market activity, and this is all for good reasons. The challenges of regulating securities and securities-related activities that cross borders are well understood. Arriving together at workable answers that cost-effectively fulfill the regulatory mission is admittedly difficult, but also crucial. What are the key challenges? First, and most obviously, scope. Market participants must know which rules, foreign or domestic, to follow in any given situation. It is important that this be clearly demarcated and easy to understand. Second, one must deal with conflicts in laws and regulations. If the laws in two jurisdictions give contradictory answers, whose law is to apply? Third, a regulator should be mindful of duplicative regulation and the application of duplicative regulatory resources that cross-border activity may face, which amounts to imposing an unnecessary cost on industry. Minimizing such duplication is important to promoting efficient markets. And fourth, the gaps in regulation must be addressed. If cross-border activity is permitted to flow, what stops market participants from moving their activities to jurisdictions with substantially less costly and less effective regulation? A domestic regulator may be fine to have that happen, of course, if it is solely the concern of other jurisdictions. But the calculus must change when those possibly underregulated services are flowing back into one's own market. Exposure to such services undermines both the integrity of the domestic marketplace as well as the competitiveness of the domestic market participants who, by virtue of a stronger home regulatory regime, face higher compliance costs. And of course, when we are speaking of something like the over-the-counter derivatives market, we know that, at least potentially, massive amounts of risk may be crossing borders. I'd like to emphasize the exposure presented by gaps in one particular area of regulation that matters deeply to the SEC, the rigor of inspections and enforcement. Despite comparability or sufficiency of the written regulatory regime, we may ask how any one jurisdiction can assure itself that another jurisdiction on whose regulation it may choose to rely to some extent has a truly comparable regime that is being effectively implemented, supervised, and enforced. That is a key consideration. In an effort to deal with these many challenges, regulators have developed a number of mechanisms to seek to maintain high-quality regulatory standards while trying to prevent the negative aspects of regulatory arbitrage. At one end of the spectrum, a regulator might simply insist that foreign entities that are participating in its market must categorically follow all its rules. The costs to this are obvious. What about the conflicts? What about the duplication? In light of these issues, a regulator may decide to make certain exceptions for foreign entities on either a case-by-case basis or generally. At the other end of the spectrum, a jurisdiction may allow a foreign market participant to follow its home country rules, but on the condition that they strictly mirror the host country's requirements. This model presents its own obvious set of challenges. In the middle of the spectrum is what the SEC proposed last week for regulation of cross-border over-the-counter derivatives activities, in particular securities-based swaps transactions that the SEC is charged to oversee. We are calling the proposed approach substituted compliance. This involves permitting foreign participants in our markets, under certain circumstances, to comply with a foreign jurisdiction's regulatory requirements in substitution for the SEC's requirements. Specifically, this would be allowed if the SEC were to determine that the foreign regime achieves regulatory outcomes comparable to those sought in our regime. SEC staff analysis indicates that the majority of over-the-counter derivatives that will be subject to our rules involved counterparties located outside of the U.S. The OTC derivatives market is global in nature and interconnected. Our approach to regulating this market then must reflect this reality, and consequently, the challenges in regulation that I previously described, defining the scope of regulation, conflicts, duplication, and gaps. Let me briefly summarize how the proposal does this. In general, the SEC's proposal would subject security-based swap transactions to the requirements of the U.S. regime if they are entered into with a U.S. person or otherwise conducted within the U.S. This addresses the challenge I mentioned earlier of defining the scope of regulation. That's known as a territorial approach. Here's where it gets more interesting. The proposal addresses duplication in the following way. Substituted compliance allows a party to comply with SEC requirements by following, as a substitute, the requirements of a foreign regulatory regime, provided that those foreign requirements have been determined by the Commission to achieve comparable regulatory outcomes. The SEC proposes to make its comparability determinations in 4 categories of regulation. The outcomes-based focus of the proposed approach provides that the SEC could make a substituted compliance determination, notwithstanding differences in granular requirements of particular regulatory categories. Avoiding gaps is achieved through the following. If the home country requirements do not, in the view of the SEC, achieve comparable regulatory outcomes, substituted compliance would not be permitted, and the foreign entity would be required to comply with the applicable U.S. requirements for that category of regulation. This is not an all-or-nothing approach. It is graduated in that it allows for the acceptance of some aspects of a foreign regulatory regime, even if some other categories of that regime are not deemed comparable, and despite possible differences in details. Foreign market participants could still participate in our market if they chose to do so. They simply need to comply with our requirements with respect to those areas of regulation not available for substitution with foreign requirements. The proposal reflects the realities of a global market while maintaining the safeguards we demand in our domestic regulatory framework. As proposed, substituted compliance differs from the EU's approach of making an all-or-nothing equivalence determination on the entire jurisdiction's regime. Instead, market participants from foreign jurisdictions could participate in our market, even if their home regulatory framework is not exactly the same as ours. The U.S. and many other countries are at various stages in the implementation of derivatives regulatory reform efforts. how the major derivatives jurisdictions adopt regulations will determine whether market participants are subject to multiple and overlapping regulatory regimes. This, in turn, could adversely affect liquidity and efficiency in the global over-the-counter derivatives market. If adopted by the Commission, substituted compliance would be a new approach in how we regulate certain foreign market registrants. The SEC's proposal, and indeed the live debate among the international regulatory community, reflect that regulators are keenly attuned to how closely our markets are linked. It is a tribute to the efforts that regulators around the world have made in seeking common ground. Despite similar regulatory objectives, however, regulatory differences will remain. They always will. But our jobs as regulators, given the nature of today's global market and the needs of investors, is to seek to minimize those differences so that they protect investors in a cost-effective manner, do not materially prohibit market participants from operating in multiple markets, and at the same time help ensure that regulatory principles and approaches, as deemed important by each individual regulator, can still be followed. By asking these hard questions and undertaking this analysis, we will achieve more cost-effective protections for investors, while at the same time increasing market efficiency and competitiveness. Thank you.